Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agarwal and you are watching our special series Demystifying Regulation and Technology. Today's session is on the theme digital media and OTT regulations, the evolving legal and tax aspects. Before we deep dive with this August panel, let's do some context setting on the same. Digital media has blended content and technology effectively, has largely been unregulated, and there's been complete creative freedom afforded to creators. The Indian audience has welcomed this wave, and this compounding consumption of content has also induced growth in the number of OTT platforms launched in India. Many people see this as a good thing. However, this has been seen as a negative facet of digital media and OTT platforms. There have been various controversies, including hurting religious sentiments, defamation, obscenity. Web series like Patal Lok and Tandav have faced large scale hate campaigns for allegedly being Hindu-phobic, with police complaints filed against the shows and their platforms. Similarly, Sacred Games allegedly had abusive language against a former prime minister. AK versus AK was accused of hurting the sentiments of the IAF, and an injunction was filed to censor the Netflix show Hasmukh, as there was a monologue that allegedly defamed lawyers, among other cases. So there has been a rampant abuse of social media to share morphed images of females, and revenge pornography has hurt the dignity of women. Blatantly unethical behavior due to corporate rivalries has led to misuse of social media by enterprises. Now, the Ministry of Information Broadcasting has stressed some regulation of OTT platform and digital media. Bill Hazlitt once said, when something ceases to be a subject of controversy, it ceases to be a subject of interest. OTT platforms and digital media are worried about what sticky content could be on their platform since they have to abide by information and broadcasting guidelines. The downside to these platforms, when there are no guidelines, is that what consumers see is dependent on the whims and fancies of those platforms, and when they have issues, the redressal mechanisms have no accountability and there's a complete lack of transparency. Now, the question is that the updated regulations say that if a government agency or individuals object to something controversial, it can be taken down, and this mechanism could impact revenue for digital media and OTT platforms. The intent of regulation seems to be to curtail content that could be problematic and be a speed breaker at a time when digital media is so fast paced. But it will continue to evolve as long as stakeholders and policymakers continue to discuss what could be balanced and yet effective. However, the question is, can a code of ethics still be maintained while at the same time preserving the right to freedom of expression? Number two, can there be subjective yardsticks when it comes to classifying content? Number three, can there be robust redressal mechanisms in case of any issues individuals face? And number four, with blurred territorial classification in the digital era, would a restrictive regime such as this lead to a surge in content piracy? To break it all down, please help me welcome the women power on the panel today, Tanu, Banerjee, and Vinita Krishnan, partners at Khaitan Co, to understand more on this burning topic. Tanu and Vinita, thank you and welcome to talking to us. Tanu, let me begin with you and I'll get on to Vinita on the tax and implications within this conversation. Taking it further from my initial remarks and how I started, this really is the burning topic at the heart of whatever we're seeing right now. If I were to start a digital media company now as an entrepreneur, having transitioned working in a large media company, or any other entrepreneur for that matter, when liquidity of capital is not at all a problem, what are the five most important concerns I should be paying in mind?
Thanks, Shrija. Thanks for having us. And what an interesting session and what an interesting topic today. Um, I think you're right. In some ways, digital media as a business has become a more complicated business to set up and to run and to scale. But having said that, there's also everything that we do today in some way or the other is digital media, right? So whatever business or novel business that you may want to set up today would in some ways be digital and in some ways be media, right? Now, what are the five most important things? First, of course, and those five things, these are in no particular order. I think they all go hand in hand. But I'll start with, of course, capital. Like you said, it is a capital intensive business. There's a lot of investment that goes into creating good content today in the first place, right? Investing in talent, investing in marketing, advertising, creating that visibility for your business. And then, of course, the whole life cycle of how a content is developed and created and then put to the audience. There's a whole cycle to it, from developing it, getting talent on board, production, post production. So I think, of course, capital is one thing. The next one would be all of your media business is very, very IP centric. It's a creative business. Technology or content are both forms of IP. So a lot of investment and a lot of sort of diligence needs to be done around compliance and protecting your IP. That would mean dealing with the regulations properly, being aware, setting up the right compliances right in the big from the beginning itself. um, and then, of course, protecting IPs is another facet altogether. Third, I would say, is again technology and data. A lot of investment needs to be done in how your tech is, and your tech constantly keeps evolving and constantly keeps getting better. So there's constant investment there also. Data, again, a lot of people invest a lot of money today in data analytics, in analyzing user behavior, what is working, what is not working, for your users, for your audience, for the market that you're operating in. A lot of investment goes there. Again, rights management, digital rights management is a huge business and a huge investment today. So a lot of money, a lot of capital, a lot of measures go there. Uh, Fourth, I would say really innovation, because if you don't constantly keep innovating today, I think you can come up with one vision of your business, and you can start that. But everybody is innovating, so if you don't keep adding on features, somewhere you will fall behind in the race. So there's also constant need to keep thinking, constant need to keep reading the market, reading the audience, and developing further onto your product, right? So that's innovation. And I think the fifth and the most important in terms of setting up business is really getting your structures right, right, legally, and tax efficient structures. And I think I'll bring in Vinita here to talk about the tax aspects. But that's, I think a lot of entrepreneurs miss that in the first go, because there's so much, and for the right reasons. I think there's so much rush to launch, and be out there and be in the market. But, a lot of entrepreneurs, in our experience, miss the initial structuring and getting that right.
What I'm understanding is that every aspect of building a digital media company, ranging from technology to innovation to be investing in your IP. So while capital is one moat that you require, and that can be a moat for you, the question is that from a regulatory perspective, what are the things that you need to be knowing? And are you suggesting that all these elements which go into building a successful digital media enterprise bring with itself different set of regulations which you need to be extremely wary of, right?
Yeah,
Are
absolutely.
they,
Absolutely. I think, see, in terms of just compliance, there is a whole set of regulations today that we have, right? Until 2 years ago, we didn't have anything specific which was codified for the digital media industry. Today, we have it. And if we do a fine comb, reading of what those regulations are, all of them are capital intensive. It needs effort and it needs time and it needs the resources and the infrastructure to get right, that aspect of the regulations and compliance, and there's no way around that, right? It's the cost of doing business. It's the law of the land. um, so that's, of course, one aspect of just your operational compliance in terms of following the regulatory landscape, to be on the right side of it. I'll give you a very, very practical example here. I think a lot of technology and a lot of media companies face that today. um, the minute a particular app is popular, right, you would see on the app store, and you could practically see that every app which is popular has a fake app on the app store. And a lot of people like you and me will just do a, you'll search on the app store, you'll have, five apps with the same name, and sometimes you'll click the right one, but sometimes you won't, right? And a lot of data, a lot of content, a lot of user information gets lost just because of these fake applications, right? And what do you do around that? So I think that uh, uh, I would say knowledge of what the legislations are, where your reliefs lie, and that diligence right from the beginning is extremely important.
Thanks for that, Tanu. I would like to get Vinita in. That you've been sort of very patiently listening to your colleague, and I think that it's important to sort of get you in terms of the tax considerations. Tanu sort of very well laid out what the important considerations when setting up a digital media business in terms of the capital, innovation requirements, setting up your IP, and how all of this comes with its own set of rules, and one has to be very, very wary of that. One interesting bit that I liked about what she said, and I sort of took notes of it, where she said that everything in technology, the way technology and media has blended so beautifully, that one really can't make demarcation. And that's really the cusp of the entire regulatory frame that we're talking about. We'll talk more in detail. Rita, I want to sort of understand more from you. Tax considerations help us understand that structuring of the company and how can that really be very effective. I think that's a very important part discussed here.
Thanks, Shrija, and definitely it's enlightening to always being part of this session. So, as Tanu rightly said, we should be right from the start. That's the magic formula for any founder or a startup industry. So, purely from a taxation perspective, there are multiple things. The first thing would be the situs of the IP, right? Where is the ownership of the IP residing? So right from the day one, when an employee is rolled in, there are employment contracts, or there is a third party content, where we are taking help of a service provider. How the IP is, who's going to take the control over the IP has to be rightly agreed upon and slated upon. Because otherwise, any transition of cost of moving the IP from the service provider or the employee to the company, there is a tax implication on that. And historically, a licensing arrangement attract a 10% tax as royalty. But sometimes the nature of licensing arrangement has to be seen very clearly. Is it just a pure licensing, or there is actually a sale of a copyrighted article? And this is more relevant for a foreign entity which is engaged in a software business. And there has been always a tug of war between the tax authorities and the taxpayers, where the tax authority said it's a licensing income, whereas the taxpayer said it is nothing but a sale of copyrighted, therefore it's business income and not attracting any tax. And there was a silver lining, there was an apex court ruling which was ruled in favor of the taxpayer. And today there have been a lot of developments on the digital taxation end. A foreign entity would need to also take into account, is there any impact of equalization levy, which is a tax which unilaterally India has introduced in its tax laws, which is outside the income tax net. The third bit from a structuring angle I would want to touch upon is, like, how do you interplay with the various rules, like the information technology rules, which has come into place very recently. How does one ensure that whether there is any impact or any ripple effect from a taxation side? To give you an example, one of the requirement of the rule is, be it a foreign social media entity giant, it would be required to have a nodal officer, chief executive officer, or a grievance officer who are Indian employees. They should be based out of India. Now, typically, such kind of entities do not have any taxable presence because they don't need to have any people here. They can very well carry on the business. So, sheer presence of their employees, will it create any taxable presence risk for the foreign entity in India? Is a consideration which they should have. Definitely, one has to comply with the IT requirements. So, what care one has to look into it is, what is the role the employee is going to play? Is he going to really focus on the business side, looking at the revenue generating activity of the company, or merely going to act as more a support function, comply with the compliance requirements under the IT laws. So if the role is minimal, it should not really pose any major risk for the foreign entity.
Thanks for that, Vinita. I would like to sort of get Tanu in now. We heard the tax considerations, some important sort of lessons for entrepreneurs out there. Now, my question really is that we just before this did a session on this entire intermediary guidelines and the digital media ethics code that is notified. We will talk about that. But the interesting bit, and tell me one thing, and we were also talking about this intermediary guideline, was that painting everyone with the same brush. This is the question which keeps coming in. So I could actually be a fintech company, I could be a medtech company, I could be a fashion tech company, but because I am indulging in content by means of community engagement or business development, I also come under this new purview of the digital media ethics code, right? So I need to understand and very well be aware of what that is. And I can't sort of really get away by saying, oh, I'm a media company, I'm a fintech company. That is number one. And second, the cost of compliance. You need to have a chief compliance officer if you have 5 million registered users and more, which is like nothing given Indian startups and the size of population that we have. And that poor compliance officer to be held liable in case anything problematic happens. So I would love to hear your views on this, Tanu, that are really is our law in touch with reality here, or are we missing something extremely big?
I think, well, let me start with just saying, what is the legislative definition of digital media? Okay, which was never defined earlier, but today, because we have a legislative definition, a codified one. Um, the definition in simple words says digital media is digitized content which is transmitted over the internet or a computer network and is stored, received, and processed by intermediaries on the one hand and publishers of content on the other hand, right? So from a legislative or a regulatory standpoint, digital media entities then are broadly classified as intermediaries and publishers. Right now, what would intermediaries be? To just to break that down in a more relatable way, intermediaries would be any platform that is hosting or storing content or storing information on behalf of another user. Right, classic example being your messaging applications, your WhatsApp, or a Telegram or a Signal, social media platforms, or Facebook or Twitter, LinkedIn, blogging portals, short video applications. These are the more obvious ones, but also, say, telecom service providers. They're also doing exactly that, transmitting information from one user to the other. Internet service providers, web hosting service providers or cloud services, search engines, um, payment applications, like you said, right? So various buckets of what intermediaries are doing and what sort of platforms intermediaries are. And publishers is of course a more easy one to understand. Anybody who's publishing content, news publishers or your OTT platforms, which are more video on demand sort of platforms. But the tricky part is, in terms of intermingling and interlocking, the tricky part is that this demarcation is not based on the platform. It's based on the activity that a platform is performing. And today, most platforms are performing multiple functions, right? A fintech application will have, for example, on the face of it, it is just facilitating payments. But you go within that, you could perhaps shop for products. You could perhaps, get into another mini application and play a game. You could perhaps watch a little bit of content. Um, med tech platforms, like you said, a lot of online pharmacies, or e-commerce portals. On the face of it, really, what are they doing? Facilitating buying and selling. But they also host content. They have content for their viewers, for their, maybe it's informatory in nature, but it is still some amount of content that is published. um, Short video applications, classic example. I think they're on the face of it entirely intermediaries. One user has shot a video, uploaded a video, another viewer is watching. The platform is simply hosting content, but the music that the platform is offering, or the clips that people enact and reenact, all of that is curated by the platform. Somewhere some amount of curation is happening at the back end. So I think what I'm trying to say is that what our legislations have missed um, is this interdependence, is the fact that you can't possibly paint everyone with the same brush. And you also can't have something which is so divided in terms of compliance. Another key facet that I think has been overlooked, and perhaps the government needs to look at it again a little bit, is content is a key part of any application today. You would have some form of content being hosted. It could be just about information. It could be an ad, for example, on something. But if the primary function is not content, if the platform is not primarily, the purpose is not to publish content, the purpose is to perform some other service, enable interaction, enable trade, or anything else, then it's way too cumbersome for those sort of platforms to get into the code of ethics and then comply with those, right? And then, for example, my code of ethics says all content has to be rated a certain way. You have to be mindful of different parameters around obscenity, morality, threat to the nation, and so on. To do that sort of classification and demarcation for content which is not meant to be consumed for entertainment is very difficult. It's a huge challenge, and unfortunately, our regulations today don't particularly demarcate that. So that is a miss. But I do think that the regulations are a little bit work in progress at the moment, and I'm quite sure that it's going to go through several iterations before it finds its balance. Everyone has a different business and a different vision for their businesses. I think what needs to be done is really to come together, and for the regulators to understand the granularity of each medium, and each function that every platform and the business has. And until you have that in-depth understanding, it's never going to be effective. So that's the challenge. But the challenge also is that by the time you wrap your head around what the issue is and what the regulations need to be, the technology has already moved ahead. So that's another challenge,
It's
right?
exactly why we are having this RegTech conversation. Technology is moving so fast, and regulation is not being able to keep pace with it. I want to also understand this that after the rules were introduced, many digital media players actually challenged the rule before various courts. So, my question is that what were the grounds and what were the concerns that came to the fore, which were raised in these litigations, and what is the status of at least what has really come out of it in terms of something very meaningful and concrete?
Right. Yeah, I think there were more than 15 different litigations which were filed across the country before different high courts. And I think the reason and the ground for challenge was primarily largely twofold. Um, One being that the way it was implemented, these regulations, they were implemented as a set of rules. And typically, rules are considered subordinate legislation to the parent legislation. So, parent legislation is the IT Act, which has been existing since 2000, and the rules are notified under uh, the IT Act. The challenge is typically a subordinate legislation and its scope cannot go beyond the ambit of the parent legislation. And because the IT Act never contemplated the code of ethics, never contemplated anything about digital media, and suddenly, you had these rules which had an entire elaborate section, new definitions of digital media, news and current affairs, publishers of content, various definitions, entire code of ethics of compliance, entire way of operations in terms of setting up a grievance redressal mechanism, appointing a compliance officer, a grievance officer, and so on. So I think first basis for the challenge was that the scope of these rules as a subordinate legislation is way beyond what the Parent Act ever contemplated. So perhaps, possibly, the right way for it to have been done is to amend the parent legislation first before you come out with rules, right? So that was one primary and common ground of challenge across. The other is, of course, digital media in the content space did enjoy, and I think it still enjoys some amount of flexibility and freedom in terms of content that is shown, right? And simply because films, the other mediums, theaters have been regulated since really long. Satellite or television channels have their own legislations. So the broadcasting world and the film world has always been sort of under regulation. What was not regulated was the digital space, and therefore some amount of freedom. But what the code of ethics did is that it sort of introduced the same principles applied in the satellite or in the film world to the digital world. And I think that uh, has not gone too well with the stakeholders simply because, again, like you said, you can't see everything with the same lens. You have to understand that every medium, every platform functions differently. There is perhaps a practical reason why a satellite TV medium needs to be regulated a certain way, because simply because it's linear transmission. One show comes at a certain time every day, or for every day in the week, right? So everybody is watching that content around the same time. It's called the appointment format. 9 to 10, so and so show is going to come. So you can't really control the audience, right? So you have to have content which caters for all age groups and all kinds of audience. So perhaps that regulation and that strict regime there works, but in the digital world where today everybody has a handset, everybody can choose what they want to watch, what they don't want to watch. That same lens applied there is what people were against,
Vinita, I
actually.
would like to sort of get you in now. We spoke about the domestic and the local media company, what use environment. So let's talk about the foreign ownership. And I will talk about this in two aspects. One, of course, is this animal called the news, where the minute you mention news, the entire conversation changes. And then there's a non news aspect of it. So we'll talk about both these things in detail. So one is the news aspect, one is the non news aspect. My question to you really is that for foreign media companies looking at India, what really are the IT considerations for some of those businesses? Uh, and can you perhaps give us some color here? And have the new IT rules really created any kind of tax issue, dilemma, exposure for foreign companies or publishers?
Yeah. So, Shreya, I would want to keep it in a larger basket, like whether it is a digital tech, because everything is being looked at with the same lens, even from a taxation point of it. So, for a foreign entity, what has been the pain point, when someone is doing a digital business? You don't need to really have any presence, whether it is a OTT platform or a subscription based models or a social media, for example. What happens is, how do you really tax their profits, which whether the market jurisdiction should tax? It has been a grappling issue which not only India, the world over has been facing that issue. So what India did way back in 2016, if you could see, if the foreign entity is giving a platform whereby an Indian resident can place an ad on the online mode, then the Indian entity was required to collect a tax called as equalization levy at 6%. Then in 2020, now when we look at it, the foreign entities, if they are going to facilitate any sales or service, or they themselves are going to supply any sales service via an online platform, application, website to Indian users or anyone using an Indian IP address, they are required to pay a tax called as equalization levy, which is 2%. Now, this is the cost of doing a business in India, because an equalization levy is neither an income tax, indirect tax. It's basically an independent tax. So this is a cost which they would need to factor in. And the way it is being defined, it is quite widely defined. Anything which happens online, like everything is happening physically, but even if an order is accepted online, a payment is made online mode. That's how the wordings of the section is very widely worded. So, in a nutshell, if a foreign entity believes that I don't need to really come back to India, start a formal presence, have a branch or a subsidiary still there can be a tax impact for them in terms of the equalization levy. Then also, if they are from a country where India does not have any tax treaty, right? Usually they always come from a country like a US where there is a tax treaty. Then India had also introduced a concept called as digital presence, which is significant economic presence. So to put it in a very simple words, if the foreign entity is interacting with Indian customers and the user base is around 300,000, or they are transacting in sales services, and the transaction value is just Indian rupees 2 crore, they can be said to have a taxable presence and their global profits can be taxed in India. Of course, today the impact is not really felt because most of the countries who are in digital space are from US, or they come from a treaty benefit country and they are eligible to tax treaty benefits. The third thing which they need to keep in mind is, as I had mentioned, the licensing arrangements. Many times in the media sector or the digital space, they may have a licensing arrangement. They may ask someone in India to help in making the contents, help in making the software develop in India. Now, whether the situs of the IP is in foreign or in India has to be seen right from the beginning. Diligence and structuring care should be done. And the Indian transfer pricing provisions also play a large role over there. And if you could look at it globally, like in July 2021, approximately the date, where more than 130 countries, including India, they have reached a consensus to how do you tax a digital profits. And one of the methods, which is technically called as Pillar One and Pillar Two, essentially it says that going forward, perhaps somewhere in 2023 onwards, the market jurisdiction would have a right to tax the global profits of a foreign entity. If the foreign entity has a sizable revenue, say somewhere euro 20 billion as a turnover and a profitability of around 10%. So one has to closely look into these developments, because even though you are not physically present, but if you have a marketplace in India, you may be impacted by that. And on
Thanks for
the
that, Vinita.
yeah, and just to sum up on the IT rules I did touch upon, you need to just ensure that when you are having those employees in India, what role they are going to play, so that it mitigates you from any permanent establishment or a taxable presence risk. And very technically speaking, there is also a compliance burden which comes with these IT rules, because if there are employees, you need to pay the payroll cost. And if there are payroll costs, technically there is a withholding tax obligation, and you need to have those registrations in India and file those tax returns.
We just heard from Vinita in terms of tax considerations, what really you have to keep in mind in terms of your offshore presence, the fear of permanent establishment, withholding tax considerations, and so on. My question to you, Tanu, really is that has the investment restrictions in the news business impacted publishers of news content or the digital media players? I do understand that the FDI rules, by the FDI rules, you can only have 26% as a cap, right? So, what has that really meant for the growth of the news publishing business in India digitally?
Absolutely, Shrija. It definitely, that segment is seeing the impact. I think one obvious impact was, like you said, that in 2019 that amendment was brought about, where our exchange control laws introduced a sector cap of 26% in the news business, in digital media entities that upload or stream news and current affairs. That's what the amendment says. I think the obvious impact was that because that cap did not exist previously, a lot of news businesses, a lot of digital media online businesses had already raised funds and exceeded that cap. Right? The government, of course, gave them about a year to, get within the compliance and restructure themselves. But that restructuring isn't easy as well, right? If you've already raised capital, you already have stakeholders. How do you get them to divest, right? And if you can't get them to divest, then what is your next step? You shut down the business, and that's not possible for a lot of them. So this one definite impact was that people, and I think people even now are trying to comply and see how to come around that. That's one obvious impact on existing businesses which had raised capital already. And the second impact is entry into that business now is very difficult for an entity. Foreign entry. Any, let's say, a foreign investor or a foreign player who now wants to enter the Indian market, and that foreign entity being in the new space specifically, it's very difficult. Because even the 26% is subject to a government approval. So you cannot invest in India unless the government approves it, right? And that's therefore, in terms of setting up a new business which is focused around news and current affairs, that is an obvious impact. And scaling your existing business has also become a challenge. Today, even a content focused platform, which is largely an entertainment platform, may still have some amount of news content as well. So many integrations that are happening, that happen on platform, and different ways in which content is offered to its viewers. But because there's no demarcation in terms of what percentage of your platform caters to news and what percentage of your content is non-news, even if you have 1 or 2% or let's say 5% of your overall library consisting of news and current affairs, you still are under the ambit of exchange control laws. So directly, indirectly, it has had a major impact on the news side of things, definitely.
So, what really is news according to the government? What qualifies news?
Again, very interesting question. So very interesting. I'll step back on this one. So again, until the IT rules came about earlier this year, um, interestingly, there was never any definition of news in any of our legislation. Right? News was always an undefined term. Um, and the closest that we got to was judicial precedents, where the courts had analyzed and evaluated what is news, and we used to borrow those principles from judicial principles. And now the IT rules came up with this definition of news and current affairs. But means it's a long, broad definition. But the key words are newly received information, and and that is so broad. Right? So
It can be as vague as it can get.
can be as vague as it can be. It could be, and I think that's again a bit of a challenge because what are you really trying to identify as news, right? So that I think again needs to go through a little bit of thought, a little bit of reiteration. Um, uh, you know, the waterfall effect of that is that um, something which you may think is not news, for example, news in the entertainment sector, cricket updates. Those are things that people consume largely for entertainment and leisure, but it ends up being news because it's still newly received information and it's the current affairs. So that's the challenge on the news side. It's the most as a lawyer who's practicing in this space, it's something that I deal with every day. It's very interesting how complicated it has become.
I think at this point, I think it's good to get you also, Vinita, and you just heard your colleague talking about the operational side. But I think it's a good idea to talk about from you on the business implications. If I were a large investor, say like a SoftBank or a Tiger Global, writing a $200 million check into a digital media company, I mean, what would you be advising me on? Like, really?
So,
In terms of tax
it, it,
implication, in terms of the income, the profit generated, what really I have to keep in mind from a regulatory perspective?
So it's not that bad, I would want to say, from a tax perspective. So from I would again try and say purely from an investor, like when you write a check, when you subscribe to capital, there have been certain challenges, like in terms of what is the valuation which the Indian entity is looking at it, like
Hmm.
especially on the startup tech side and the media side or the OTT platforms or the e-commerce operators. The valuations can they generally change overnight, you would have seen by experience. So one of the challenges which is being seen is the valuation justifiable, or is there any tax risk for the Indian company? Because if the valuation is not justifiable, the tax laws allows the tax officer to tax the excess valuation in the hands of the Indian entity. Of course, it may not really apply to when a soft bank or a foreign investor is making this investment, but these provisions are still being tested practically at the ground level by the tax officer. So the first point is the valuation, where as an investor, is the valuation justified, and have a robust valuation to support the source of investment. The second is from a diligence angle. The deal can be even, you may just acquire the shares at the global co level, which may be ultimately having those media rights or the technology and subsidiaries in India. Even though you may
Mm-hmm.
feel that you're actually buying the stake at the overseas level, there can still be a
Mm-hmm.
tax leakage for the sellers in India, and as a buyer there can be corresponding withholding tax, similar to the famous Vodafone issue. So again, it becomes very vital, what is the India business, which is and how much is it the real value driver to the overall US entity. And somewhere again it is linked to what is the where is the IP being situated, and if there are lapses, it's not been properly undertaken, properly structured, and if IP is in India, it may tilt the tax in favor of the Indian entity. And the third thing is, more or less from a hygiene point of it, how an Indian entity is run. There are, quite certainty which is being given in the way, and there are tax rates which can vary from base rate of 22% to 30%. One can explore that and have a better way of functioning the subsidy. So overall, these are some of the key things which they need to do. And yes, if there are intercompany transactions which they plan to have, you should have a robust transfer pricing mechanism in place. And if there are any online use of portal, factor the tax cost. What would be the tax cost in using those digital means, so that tomorrow there is no surprise for them.
Thanks for that, Vinita. Tanu, I have the same question for you. Your key sort of three pieces of advice for a large foreign investor writing a check to a digital media company from a regulatory perspective. Am I getting into a space which is extremely regulated now? From a regime of one where you just began your conversation saying that content companies enjoyed quite a bit of freedom, to where we have come now, which has become increasingly a headache to start digital media company in India. What really are the key concerns or the key things a foreign investor should look out for? Writing a big check, substantial big check, which involves a lot of content.
Right, no one's intent is that a certain space should be completely unregulated for it to be an opportunity or a good opportunity, right? um, and the regulatory landscape, like I said, it's evolving, right? There's one set of rules that have come about. There's so much so many challenges there. The courts are evaluating it, even the government has evaluated it, right? They've come up with multiple clarifications. Perhaps they'll amend something in future. So I think yes, the regulatory landscape is a work in progress, is developing, it's evolving. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that that regulatory landscape should deter a foreign investor or any investor from investing in the sector. The M&E sector, in fact, right now is one of the most promising sectors in India. And just if we just look at broad statistics, very very broad statistics, um, we are a 1.3 billion economy, and our penetration in terms of our digital penetration in terms of the number of internet users that we have today is 900 million, as per a TRI report that was published recently, right? So the delta is not huge for a country which still has a large section of rural population. A 900 million internet base, user base is huge, and simply because internet is cheaper, more accessible. Mobile devices are not luxury items anymore. Everybody has it. All of that is obviously led to a massive growth in the industry, right? So it's definitely a very very promising industry, and India is definitely a very promising zone to be right now. The M&E, the annual growth rate is pegged at 13 to 14%, right? So imagine the opportunity that it is. So I think it's a great space to invest in right now. Yes, there are hurdles around compliance, and that hurdle is largely because earlier there was no framework at all. So today there is a framework, and that seems like it's a hurdle because you've you've developed and you scaled up your business in an environment which was regulation free, and now to step back and get those compliances in place, it's a um, I would say it's a phase.
I also wanted to understand that we spoke about news, we spoke about technology and media, this beautiful interplay. We spoke about taxation consideration. We spoke about what does it mean for a foreign company operating to be investing in India. Let's spend a bit of time in talking about the OTT platform, which seems to be gaining a lot of traction, rightly so, as the cord cutter generation seems to be on the rise. There are people who don't necessarily watch traditional television, they only consume entertainment content through the OTT platform. So while OTT is fantastic, it gives you great content, different content, and that is how the entire genesis of OTT was. Is it now getting too much into the eye of the regulator on what content can you really, really put out there?
It definitely is on the radar, but I would again say that the reason it's on the radar is because it was completely unregulated earlier on, right? There is an intent to come up with a framework. There is an intent to come up with a regulation. Perhaps what we have come up with is not as light touched, perhaps, as it could have been or it should be, or what the stakeholders expect it to be. Um, but I would think some amount of, a little bit of deeper dive into the actual business of OTT and what goes on, and a little bit of dialogue between the government and different stakeholders. I'm quite sure that it will evolve eventually to be a balanced framework. At the moment, it's not balanced for sure. That's
Okay.
definitely.
It is always a tussle between the regulators and the entrepreneurial community out there. We have seen this in the case of crypto, Bitcoin, intermediary guidelines, and a similar scenario is playing out in the case of digital media platforms also. There's a platform economy, there's this entire financial wars economy, and now there's digital media. I only wonder what will happen when we talk about the realities of metaverse and what really with a set of rules to abide by when you're talking about a different universe out there. But before that, I think it's a good concluding question to conclude this series and to conclude this episode on is what do you think should be the thinking lens of the lawmaker in going about the digital media rules? The thinking lens perhaps now seems to be very, very embedded in the IT rules, and everything seems to be stemming from there. And like you mentioned, everything is subordinate when the IT rules come by. So, what really should be the thinking lens? One or two parameters you think with the lawmakers should think by when they talk about digital media. I'll start with you, Vinita. One lens from you and the other from Tanu. Yes.
I think somewhere the certainty in terms of how do you want to tax them is something which they, while everyone has worked towards it, but more closer you reach the results would be good and way a long way for the sector.
Okay. Tanu, what about you?
I would say, and like I was saying earlier on also, I think one definite need is for the regulators to really do a deep dive into the business and understand each medium, and also understand the scale of each business, right? Today, what the compliance or the regime that is perhaps necessary for a Facebook, or a Twitter, or an Amazon Prime, or a Netflix, which are really large, old
Yeah.
businesses scaled up over years and years, right? That same lens and that same compliance framework, when applied to a smaller business, is as good as not letting that business grow at all, right? So the bigger businesses keep growing. The smaller businesses find it hard to set up in the first place and then be burdened with the entire compliance regime. So I think that understanding is very, very necessary for it to be effective eventually.
So the smaller businesses are being penalized when the intent perhaps is to go after the big ones. So it's time for doing some quick rapid fire. Only one question for each one of you. And I'll start with you, Tanu. What are you Netflixing these days? Given we're talking about digital media.
What am I Netflixing? I don't remember the last time I was Netflixing. uh, But my all-time favorite is the period series. Like we call it, on the lines of Downton Abbey or Crown. So that era is where I like to sit in. So anything of that genre is usually on my playlist.
Okay. And one case which came to you and which really got you thinking, which was like the best that you have worked on till now in the digital media space, which really got you thinking and something which really got the best out of you.
One of my most fulfilling matters and that I do, and a client that I work with, um, I've helped one of the largest platforms, OTT platforms in India, to set up their business. And I started working from them from the time it was just an idea and nobody knew about it. So I started from setting that business, to helping them fill up the library, structure their content deals, tech deals, and today it feels great to see that it's one of the larger platforms, and that's been really fulfilling, I think. Also,
Okay. The same
again,
question. Yeah.
it's
The
been
same question for you, Vinita. You know, the most fulfilling deal that you have worked on, or the most fulfilling matter in your career till now.
So again, I would not have liberty to name, but there have been very good deals where we have worked more from a tech sector point or a media sector point, where there have been acquisitions by the buyer, and the deal size have been, more or less around 8 billion as well, have been part of the global deals. And again, it was fantastic to see as part of diligence, and we worked very seamlessly with Tanu in various other matters where how we could really come up and see what are the things which we have seen. So those are the things. And otherwise, from a platform angle point of it, because of the changing digital tax, what are the implications? Even there are automobile industries where they have in-house ERP platforms, whether that has any impact or not. How do you really read those equalization levy? These things which come often to us.
Okay, thanks for that. And lovely listening to both these women who are specialists in their area and really out there to take on the world with their knowledge. Thanks, Tanu, and thanks, Neeta, for this. On a Friday evening, we had this discussion on digital media and where does the future really lie in terms of taxation and the legal aspects. Keep watching the Khaitan and Company and Mint Rector conversation. Till time I see you next. Goodbye and good luck. Thank you. Bye
thanks,
bye.
Shrija.
Thank you.